What's the problem with landing on the ground? When did that fall out of fashion?
Because you can't roll out of bed and have yourself an espresso and then stroll out onto your glass, shrouded balcony and hop in your flying car and leave. You can't be Batman.
You're listening to the Struck Podcast. I'm Dan Blewett.
I'm Alan Hall.
And here on Struck, we talk about everything aviation, aerospace engineering, and lightning protection.
Wide range of topics on today's show. First, we're going to talk about the FAA stopping flights on the West Coast here in the U.S. Because of a North Korean missile launch. Pretty crazy. We'll talk about Brussels, how one airline there has been having to fly empty routes, empty aircraft to keep slots at airports. Growing problems with air traffic. We'll talk about Qatar Airways finally filing a lawsuit against Airbus over the lightning protection and the skin issues that have been ongoing. We'll talk about a propeller hitting a bird and breaking off through the fuselage, which is terrifying, and some more MCAS design. We'll have a little conversation about that, re the Boeing 737 MAX. In our eVTOL segment, we'll talk about Joby. They've got a second aircraft now to double their flight testing capacity, a bellwether half-scale prototype, talk about the implications of that. And lastly, we'll chat a little bit about eVTOL stocks and what we should expect from them in the near future. So, Alan, first thing here, the FAA grounded flights at West Coast airports here in the U.S. over what they suspected was a North Korean missile test. Obviously, that's been heavily in the news cycle recently. You haven't really heard of this before. This seems like a pretty new, kind of crazy thing, right?
I haven't heard of airplanes being grounded because the North Koreans are firing a missile off North Korea, which is a long ways away from California. But there must be some concern about North Korea firing a missile into the United States. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a system to ground airplanes. So the missile launch, which is monitored by the military all the time, they must detect it. They must have a hotline to the FAA and to the ground controllers to tell everybody just to hold tight and not go anywhere until the all clear signal is given, which is what happened. And isn't it a little weird, Dan? Because why would we be concerned about a missile launch in North Korea getting to California unless there is some sort of increased tensions about a missile landing in California or anti-missile technology being launched from California up to the sky? What are the other rationales for shutting down those flights temporarily?
Yeah, it's a scary thought. And I was always kind of under the assumption that North Korean missiles were like made of cardboard or something, and had just graffiti on them with Sharpies. But that's probably not the case. And I know everyone's developing their technology, and it's obviously very scary if North Korea is starting to actively test again. But yeah, it's definitely concerning. I wonder what people who are potentially on those flights are thinking. Like, were we going to get shot down?
Right. Yeah, and Japan cannot be happy with that. And they've been very upset because those missiles tend to go over Japanese airspace, and the Japanese are concerned about something stupid happening, right? And it's a bargaining tool, how it has been a bargaining tool for the North Koreans to try to get the U.S. and a number of other countries to the bargaining table. But the last couple of months has been, unless I'm missing something, I don't think so. It's been relatively quiet on the North Korean front. It doesn't seem the Biden administration is making any overtures and has basically cut North Korea off, and like the Obama administration did. And maybe that's causing increased tensions. It's going to be hard to say, but if we're shutting down airline flights, at least temporarily on the West Coast, something serious is happening right now.
Yeah, and I guess the speculation is that they might have a Mach 5, a hypersonic missile, which I guess is harder for missile defense systems to detect and, I guess, destroy versus a ballistic missile.
Yeah, sure. Shorten the time frame to respond. Absolutely, it would.
Yeah, that's scary. So I'm sure we'll hear more about it in the coming days and weeks. Hopefully, good news, and we'll get back to some, I guess, better days of diplomacy. But North Korea has obviously always been North Korea. So moving on, still more air traffic issues. Brussels Airlines is operating 3,000 flights with almost zero passengers on them, just to avoid losing slots at some airports. Alan, have you heard of this before? There's just a lot of unprecedented things in the world at this time.
Yeah, well, in most airline terminals, that they have a requirement. You got to use the slot or you're going to lose the slot, and they pay money to take those slots. In Europe, they have an agency that oversees those. And I think pre-COVID, you had to be at the slot 80% of the time. And if you didn't show up 80% of the time, then they're going to give your slot to somebody else. And then they lowered it. I think for a while they kind of stopped that practice and then brought it to 50%. So you had to show up 50% of the time now to keep the slots. And in some, because of this new wave of COVID that's happening, some of those flights they don't want to run, but the airlines don't want to run because they're not full enough to run them. They like to consolidate into fewer airplane flights for a variety of reasons, obviously cost and two, environmental reasons. They like to not fly all those routes all the time. And they're going to be penalized. And so now Brussels Airline, which is part of Lufthansa system, is having to fly those flights that they would otherwise cancel or consolidate into fewer flights in that same time span. And that's not smart. I don't think you blame an airline for not showing up all the time right now, because it's so hard to tell week to week what your passenger loading is going to be. And even if you have booked people, the place booked, people are not showing up to the airports because they're concerned about COVID at the moment. And I don't know how you penalize an airline for that. I could see them penalizing them like they had operational problems and they couldn't get the airplanes to fly and get up where they're supposed to be on time. But this is not an airline problem. This is a pandemic endemic that you would think that the regulators would see and be able to, be a little more flexible with. It's very odd, I think, thing to do.
And Brussels Airlines has clarified that they're not empty flights, but they're just not. They're not making them any money, so they're in the red. And I'm sure they've done all the math as a company to say, what should we do here? Should we just not show up? Kind of just like if with rent in COVID times, like should we just stop paying the rent and just abandon ship? Should we just go under, or do we want to keep paying the rent even though we're not making any money for a while? It seems like that same kind of deal.
Yeah, right. You may want to give up some of those gates just to keep the cash flow coming.
Yeah, I'm sure they'll do that if they figure out that makes the most financial sense. So moving on, Qatar Airways has moved to sue Airbus because of their A350 jet damage. That's been an ongoing thing that we've covered here. And the lawsuit, I think, is for $600 million. Is that right, Alan?
Yeah, it's a lot of cash. $600 million is, at least in regular people's terms, it's a lot of money.
Is this just going to get them to the settlement table? I assume this probably will not go to trial, or is this going to be something that would be fought tooth and nail? What do you think?
I think this is going to trial. I think this may be decided by a judge, weirdly enough, because the airline and Airbus have been going back and forth for a little over a year, and it's been very high levels of animosity on the airline side. I think Airbus has been fairly quiet and hasn't put anything into the press publicly stated, right? I'm sure they're talking to reporters, but it is very odd how far this has gotten. And I think the little news piece I saw, which may be indicative of why they're in court right now, is they were going to paint an older A350 that was about maybe it was about 5 years old, and you're going to put the World Cup paint job on it. And when you repaint a composite airplane with metallic mesh like the A350 has, you got to be careful because you can damage that mesh. And what the airline is saying is there's about 1,000 places on that airplane that they were going to repaint. There's 1,000 places where that metal foil has been damaged. So they got to do 1,000 repairs. And if I know that I'm going to have to paint all those airplanes I have at some point, no matter what, because you do, that's going to be massively expensive because those repairs, and it's going to make the airplanes look ugly too, or it can, if it's not done right. And it's going to add a lot of weight to the airplane. It's not huge, but enough that it would matter. And the expense would explode. So you, as an airline, you see this unexpected routine expense that you're going to have to pay to keep these airplanes flying. And now Airbus, I think, is reacting correctly and saying that it's not a safety issue. It doesn't appear to be a safety issue, but the Qatar regulator has pulled the type certificate on 21 aircraft, basically grounded 21 of the A350s and prevented them from flying because of this mesh issue. And so not only are you're losing money on those airplanes because they're not flying, it's got to be a couple $1 million a day. But there's usually some contractual things about airplanes which will allow you to recover if there's some sort of inherent defect that they can go recover. And that's what Qatar appears to be doing, is going right after the contract and saying, look, guys, we have a contract that says you have to pay us if these airplanes don't do X, Y, Z, and we're going to take you to court. And that's where they're at right now. And Dan, don't you see this as sort of a bigger problem, not so much for Airbus, but for the industry? Because the 787, it really isn't much different. They're going to have the same issue, I think.
Well, and isn't that going to become a big issue for Airbus, especially if Qatar wins this lawsuit or gets a settlement? I mean, is everyone else going to sue after that? You imagine that they would.
I think there'll be, especially if they find a court that's agreeable to the argument. And they're in the United Kingdom for this judgment. But yeah, I think everybody else lines up behind them and creates a quote unquote class action type of event, and away they go. And it could be expensive. And you hope that Airbus, one of the things about deciding airplane contracts or airplane performance in the courtroom is rarely do you think the court understands all that's going on. And Airbus is making a really good contention that it's not a safety issue. If it's not a safety issue, then it can be dealt with and repaired. And rightly so. I think just Qatar disagrees vehemently with that approach.
Well, should Airbus pay for the repairs, or should Qatar pay for the repairs? Like, isn't that sort of the thing?
And I had talked to Tim Heffer at Reuters about this last summer. And my first thought was, and I haven't seen this talked about in the press, but my first gut feeling was that the airline had sent the airplane to be repainted somewhere. And when it was getting repainted, it got damaged. And Airbus doesn't want to pay for the airlines damaging the airplane, which makes sense.
Speaking of airline damage, a crazy set of pictures from a JS-41 Jetstream that hit a large bird upon landing in South Africa. And Alan, it looks like this was a natural composite propeller, right? So it's got a wood core instead of a foam core. Is that right? What's the construction of this?
Looks like it has a wood core to it. It's just from the remnants of the propeller that are left.
Yeah, so it, I guess, hit a pretty large bird. And reading through some of the comments, there's some really savvy commenters on this article from AV Herald that I guess they're typically rated for like a 4-pound bird. That's the test, that right? But obviously exceeding that, who knows what's going to happen. But pieces broke off, went into the fuselage. Luckily, no one was sitting in that row, so there were no injuries. But good grief, what a bunch of photos this is. And that could have just been a horrific thing. And no one was injured, which is remarkable.
It could damage aircraft systems, obviously. It could really kill passengers. And that makes you wonder, when I saw that, and I said, man, the core of that blade is made out of wood. That seems unusual to me in today's world. And maybe I just haven't been that closely tied to propellers. I've tested a lot of propellers in the Lightning Lab over the years. I don't remember coming across one that had a wood core in it. But you got to wonder if the wood being part of the structural element is one of the reasons it broke off the way that it did. It's outside of the typical certification requirements, right? I don't know what size bird this thing hit, but it was big to snap that blade off. And you're lucky they didn't snap more of them off. And then there wasn't a flock of these birds either, thank goodness, because they would have taken the aircraft down. So this is just one of those, put it in your hip pocket. I did some looking online about the different kinds of propellers, and there are some that are made out of wood. At least the one I found was over in Europe, and I don't think in the United States we make a lot of wood propellers except on these eVTOLs that are going on. That's the only place I've seen it recently, or older, like a Piper Cub or something of that sort. Yeah. So, strange.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what a greater than 4 pound bird looks like, because a duck is probably not 4 pounds, right? They're probably what, 2-3 pounds. Birds are pretty light creatures. Obviously, they fly, so I'm guessing goose size.
Yeah, I mean, goose to ostrich, somewhere in between in between those two. An emu? Yeah, I mean, it's got to be something fairly good size.
I mean, a chicken, you buy a chicken at the grocery store, like a roaster, they're what, like 2-3 pounds for the bulk of the body? And of course, those are not natural birds. They have a huge breast, right? So if they're not pumped full of those hormones, you're talking probably a little bigger than a chicken to get to 4 pounds total with the head and all the feathers and all that stuff. So maybe it would have to be a goose, something like that.
That'd be something goose size. Yeah, I would think so. But even then, you kind of wonder, would it snap the blade off? I think in those tests that the blades will tolerate a lot more typically. So when I saw this, I thought, man, it must have hit something like an ostrich. Like it really had to hit something hard to snap it off the way that it did, because it kind of broke it off near the hub. It's like it just snapped off the tip. It broke it off way down towards the hub of the propeller.
Ostrich would have to have a pretty mighty jump, since they're flightless birds, aren't they? They're flightless, aren't they? Yeah, ostriches and emus are flightless. But, well, South Africa, I'm sure, has some exotic bird species that we're not aware of here in the U.S. But, yeah, that's some terrifying photos. So glad no one was injured there. So last in this segment, let's talk about statement from Peter Lemmy over on Twitter, just talking about the MCAS. Alan, fill us in on this tweet, and Mr. Lemmy, he seems like he's a well-known industry guy.
So Peter worked for Boeing for a long time and has, if anybody follows him on Twitter or even on his web blog, he's very knowledgeable and understands sort of the system architecture to the way Boeing has designed airplanes over time. And I'm not even sure where he digs up some of the information which he'll publish, because he must have access to manuals and things that I obviously don't have access to. But he understands how systems are designed. And so it's very refreshing to actually cross somebody that's not, because people that work at Boeing now don't get to say a lot, that understands how the systems on a 737 were likely designed, or how they are designed and how they're intended to function, and the evolution, which is the most important part here, the evolution of the 737 and how the flight control system has changed and evolved over time. That airplane is 50 years old, roughly. And obviously the flight controls have changed according with the times. And what Peter is saying is trying to highlight, there's a lot of focus on the AOA sensor. Very true. But what Peter's saying is the whole system is a single line system, which means there's no dual redundancy in any part of the MCAS system for the 737, because the criticality wasn't high enough to force it to be basically a two-channel or two independent streams of control there. And the highlight that what Peter is trying to talk to is there were a couple of changes made to the MAX version of the 737, where on the control yoke on pilot and co-pilot, you could pull back on the stick and there was a switch underneath the floor. And that switch would disconnect the autopilot, in this case, it would have disconnected the MCAS system. So if the pilot pulls back hard enough, and that switch senses that force, it would disconnect MCAS. So all the pilot would have to do, if they were in a panic situation, or there was some sort of weird runaway situation, which was what happened, the pilot would just pull back and it would have disconnected the system. So Boeing made an architecture change on a switch at the bottom of each of the control columns that would have stopped that reaction. And Peter also mentions that they were relying upon the pilots to make a correct decision to retrim the aircraft and do a couple other things, which the pilots in these two crashes didn't appear to do. So I think what Peter is highlighting is that the way aircraft get designed, it doesn't matter where it is. It could be in China, it could be in France, it could be in the United States. It doesn't really make any difference. The way that aircraft designers think through and solve design problems is from a system safety standpoint. And these changes that were made to the aircraft have maybe larger impacts than the engineers would have assumed while they're making them. So, one of the questions is, why did Boeing pull out that switch at the control yoke? Good question. Yeah, I don't know if anybody's even asked that out in the public. Probably internally between the FAA and Boeing, they may be asking that question. But that's how we solve these problems, right? We kind of get them out in the open and figure out like what the hell's going on and figure out why do we do that? Like, what was the purpose of a removal of a switch? A simple removal of a switch, and how did that cascade into other problems? And we need to figure out if we do that in the future, one minor change has bigger problems. We need to be able to see those, forecast those problems, so we don't make those quote unquote simple changes that have catastrophic effects. It's complicated, and I'm glad Peter's out there doing it because I just really haven't seen it anywhere else. So when he posts things, when he puts things on Twitter, pay attention because he's thought about them and he's very knowledgeable.
All right, moving on to our EVTOL segment today. Let's first talk about Bellwether. So this UK company, they have just put out a very Blade Runner-esque half-scale EVTOL. And Alan, my big question to you is, I mean, the looks of this thing are crazy. It's very flat, sleek, kind of looks like a Manta Ray or Stingray or, look very much like the car kind of prototype that we've seen in movies. It's beautiful, but what do you learn from testing a half-scale aircraft of any kind? Does it really translate very well? I mean,
it can. I mean, obviously, the aerodynamics are not the same because your airspeeds and things like rental numbers and some of those things don't scale like that. But if there are significant aerodynamic issues, you should be able to see it in half scale, and that's why you would do it. And the reason is it's less expensive to build because it's not a production article. You can cut a lot of corners to create the flying vehicle quickly, and it doesn't have all the bells and whistles. Obviously, it won't. But the core systems will be there. Particularly the flight control systems will be there, and this is a good time to figure out: is it going to fly? Does it have any weird aerodynamic upsets that they need to address with the flight control computer? How, again, it really like all those little safety things you don't think about because the FAA and the EASA and all the certification authorities put you through a gauntlet, right? I mean, you don't want the airplane to, whatever kind of form it takes, they don't want it crashing, right? They're trying to protect the occupants, and you need to figure those things out. And I remember not long ago, but I mean, in my engineering lifetime, yeah, we make smaller scale, 2/3 scale versions of aircraft to go check out performance and then try to scale it. But the thing about this aircraft, Dan, is like we've seen a lot of others. It's kind of a helicopterish thing, and as you get into forward flight, there's a lot of effects that happen. And what I'm guessing is they're trying to make sure that when you're moving forward, you don't have any weird aerodynamics that would stall some of the rotating blades that are in it, which would make it very difficult to control. So, it's just like, well, you fly a lot of drones. Isn't it very similar to that? The smaller drone, they make them smaller, then they take those same sort of concepts and make them larger over time. They don't start with the largest, most expensive version of this new great idea. It's very similar to that, isn't it?
I think so, and that makes sense. My other question to you is, they have a conceptual little design of, this sort of tongue, like you have a skyscraper. The skyscraper has this tongue that sticks out from the 80th floor, and that little pad is where you park your flying car. I just can't see any scenario in the future where that comes to exist. I mean, you couldn't retrofit a building like that. I can't see any way the structural design would allow for that. But B, say they started building skyscrapers in 40 years with like, maybe on like the, with 10 floors to go, they just have like a Saturn's ring sort of thing where it's this huge outdoor space and you could just land a plane there. You could picnic on there or whatever. I mean, is that really a realistic thing? Or are we always just going to use the top of buildings?
It's going to be the top of buildings. And even the top of buildings has gotten shut down quite a bit. I know that's all the eVTOL companies that are in California are using LA as an example. But, it wasn't that long ago in New York where a helicopter landed on the top of a building and fell off the side of it, right? Kind of crash landed on top of it, fell down onto the street. Right, it's not ideal. So they outlawed it. And I can't imagine Los Angeles will be much different if they have that sort of scenario happen, and hopefully it doesn't. But what's the problem with landing on the ground? When did that fall out of fashion?
Because you can't roll out of bed and have yourself an espresso and then stroll out onto your glass, shrouded balcony and hop in your flying car and leave. You can't be Batman if you park on the ground. Although Batman did live in a cave, so I retract that statement. Strike that from the record. Well, moving on, Joby has a second prototype now that they built to do flight testing with. They said this one's going to the Air Force. Alan, what's obviously twice the capacity for testing is great. Do they need a third, or what does this second one really open up for Joby?
Cash. It allows them to work with the Air Force and get paid some money to do some flight tests and to let the Air Force evaluate the technology from a military standpoint, which they're getting paid to go do. So it does help bring in some money. And in terms of visibility of the program, it makes the program a lot more visible, which is in relation to stock price and investors and all that. If any of eVTOL company that's in the process of trying to get certified needs to have flight test vehicles, typically 4, 5, 6, somewhere in there. 5 is the normal number. 6 happens once in a while if you're trying to accelerate the project. And Joby's got number 2. Like, they need 3 more, typically. Let's go, right? They're going to have to get going to get to the finish line in which they set their own finish line. And I think there's outside the aerospace industry, people assume you build one airplane, you show that it flies, and then you're good, right? That's not what happens. It's typically 5 aircraft that get built, and they have different things inside of them. Because you think of all of the multiple variations that have to happen and all the different things you need to check. You're going to need 4 or 5 flying aircraft to go do that. The last one is just usually aircraft 5 has all the interiors and bells and whistles and all the stuff in it. And that's the one they do for sort of function and reliability checks. But aircraft 1 through 4 are just as valuable to the flight test program. You just got to get them built and you got to get them flying because you're burning cash so fast. That's the only way you can stop the bleeding is to get in the flight test. So good for Joby getting the second one going. There's hopefully a couple more behind it.
Well, and that kind of transitions us into our last topic here, which is eVTOL stocks. So obviously there's a bunch on the market now. There's even Embraer is going public. Joby is public. Who else, Alan?
Archer's public, right?
Archer's public.
Vertical.
Is Beta public?
Beta. Yeah, I don't know about Beta. That's a good question.
I'm not sure about Beta. Looks like if not, they're probably a candidate for coming up soon. But the big question here is, and I believe in Joby. They seem like they're doing a great job. They're clearly the front runner, right? You look at their stock; it's been like $6, $7 down from its IPO price of it started at like 10 or 12. And you say that's not a lot of money. Why don't I buy 100 shares of Joby or 1,000 shares of Joby and just see what happens? But my question to you is, with the flight certification process taking so long, what's the advantage to buying a stock today or in a year? Or what are these companies going to do when they're not really taking any cash? So obviously you said Joby's going to get paid by the Air Force with their Agility Prime program. But most of these companies don't have a product they're selling yet, so there's no income coming in. So what should a person know about the stock market in general with some of these aircraft companies?
I would say if you're the individual investor, you have to be careful here. Just because historically the aircraft companies haven't made a lot of revenue, and there's still a good solid 2 years away from having really significant income come in if the projections are right. So your money's going to sit there for a while. And I think that's the risk. That's the risk you're going to take is right. If you get a little bit closer to certification, then and you'll see the market as the aircraft company any of them gets close to certification, you see the stock price tend to ramp up. Even Boeing, Airbus have the same thing. When they get close within about 6 months, you see the stock price start to creep up because then people are anticipating that the revenue is going to start coming in, right? And you're going to participate in the revenue part of it. that's what happens. It just the life cycle. It's you're not making iPhones here. You're making something really complicated, and it takes several years to get that done, and about $500 million to get it done. That's the trouble. That's really the trouble. And if from an institutional investor, Dan, it's risky, right? I think a lot of these Toyota invested a lot of money into Joby. That'd probably be the exception, but I would say that there's a good bit of venture capital, and venture capital needs to be successful 1 out of 10 times, right? That seems to be the marker. That if I find one Google and the rest are, selling dog food or something, then yeah, I just need one to hit. I need one to hit to pay for all the other 9. And in aviation, it hasn't been that way historically. It's been more of a sort of a passion investment. Like, I like airplanes. This is cool. I want to advance the world. I want to have a cleaner future, or whatever that angle is, tends to be where the investors' hearts are. The Eclipse, right? Eclipse was a passion play by people that were affiliated with Microsoft. Some of the earliest employees of Microsoft were heavily invested in that, and it was like a friends network of investors. Didn't work out, right? Yeah, and I think you just got to be careful. Got to be really careful. Well, with any investment, right? Not just airplanes. Any investment, got to be careful with.
Yeah, and it'd be interesting to see what. Here's my one thing with some of the tech stocks where. You could see a company that maybe they start to really struggle, right? But there's a public tech stock. They could easily be acquired, right? As they start to get cheap, they start to get in trouble. They could just get acquired. And now you didn't lose all your money. You're just stock that used to be company X is now company Y, right? Good little backup sort of fail safe there from, losing all your money if they announce bankruptcy. You could see that for maybe a couple players here. I don't know if you could see if Joby started to struggle, maybe Boeing buys them, or Airbus buys them, or an Amazon even buys them, says, hey, we still believe in this. We're going to give you a lot of cash. You're just coming with us now. But as you said, a lot of these companies will eventually go bankrupt, and they just won't be able to make money, and they won't be able to get a buyer, and they'll be too far in debt and too far from a product. Whereas that's a lot like not quite the same thing with a tech stock. Because again, we'll take your technology and we'll fix it, or we'll just, whatever. So it seems like there's maybe even a little more risk there than for some of the other stocks on the market. Obviously, there's a million stocks you could buy, but
yeah,
it seems like less of an opportunity for acquisition.
And in the way that the aircraft companies have stopped over time is they just close the doors and tell the employees there will be no more checks. And if I'm a competing aircraft company, typically they just are not interested in the whatever remains, except for the employees. They'll start putting up billboards in the town and trying to attract the engineers and the key people that come over to their company. But other than that, they don't buy any of the tooling. There's nothing they can use there. They don't care about the building, and so it just kind of gets left for another industry to take over, and they sell all the tooling. And yeah, you're right, Dan. It's not like Facebook's acquiring Instagram. It's not that, for sure. It's much more industrial than that.
There's lots of companies like that. And I mean, Instagram, I don't know if they're a good example or not. I guess they probably are. But lots of those companies, like Instagram, was not making money. They had a really big user base, but they are still well underwater. They only had 14 employees when they were acquired. But lots of companies like Uber was still very unprofitable. I'm not sure if they're profitable now, but you can have these companies that are growing really fast, that have a big user base, customer base, good technology, good people, but are unprofitable. Those are always good candidates where they're just we keep needing more cash infusions. We're finally open to being acquired rather than continuing to struggle. And again, I think you could see that with some of these top eVTOLs that have good IP and good people and are pretty close. Like the ones that are public are probably good candidates, but many of the others, yeah, they just, if they're too far down the line, people are I don't know if we need you. We could do without. But either way, it's an interesting question to ponder. Why should we invest in a stock now when they're so far away from selling a product and having revenue? That's what I wonder. Because, yeah, it piques my interest too. Could I be an investor in one of these companies one day? Yeah, I might. But again, that's my big question is why now? Why not 6 months from now? Or why not a year from now? And it's an interesting question.
The way that the investor market, the individual investor has looked at the aircraft marketplaces. They keep watch on the certification performance, keep track of where they are on the certification schedule, and when that 6 months, we got a 50 more flights to go do sort of number pops up, that's when you'll see the inflow of cash because they're pretty close. So there's a lot less risk in that kind of investment instead of investing now.
Well, that's going to do it for this week's episode of the Struck Aerospace Engineering Podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you listen or watch. Share the show with a friend. Leave us a review. We'd greatly appreciate it. Always helps the show grow. And we will see you here next week on Struck.
Strike Tape, WeatherGuard Lightning Tech's proprietary lightning protection for radomes, provides unmatched durability for years to come. If you need help with your radome lightning protection, reach out to us at weatherguardaero.com. That's weatherguardaero.com.